Moving into a new apartment is always filled with anticipation, new space, new neighbors. But what if you weren't the only one living there? Here are 3 ghost stories about living in an apartment. Number 1. The Crying Neighbor. A young man, let's call him Sam, was thrilled when he found the perfect apartment in the city. It was a little small, a bit dated, but it had character, and it was within his budget, which was a rare find. After a long day of moving in, he collapsed onto his bed, eager to start fresh in his new home. But late that night, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard something. At first, he thought it was just the sound of the city, a distant car horn or the hum of the building's old pipes. But soon, it became clear. It wasn't the city at all. It was crying, soft, sorrowful crying, as if someone was in deep pain. Sam sat up, listening intently. The crying seemed to be coming from the apartment next door. Concerned, he wondered if his neighbor was in trouble. Maybe someone was hurt. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was a bad dream, but the crying continued. It grew louder, more desperate, more heartbreaking. The next morning, Sam went about his day, trying to forget the unsettling sound from the night before. He hadn't met his neighbors yet, but he figured he would eventually. Days passed, and every night the crying returned, always around the same time, just past midnight. Finally, after a week of sleepless nights, Sam couldn't take it anymore. He decided to knock on her neighbor's door to check on them, but to his surprise, no one answered. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, silence, not a sound from inside. He pressed his ear to the door. Nothing, no crying, no voices, just dead quiet. Slightly confused, he walked away. But as he reached his apartment, the crying started again. This time, it was louder, almost unbearable. He rushed back to the door, but just as he was about to knock again, the landlord appeared. He explained the situation to the landlord, how he kept hearing crying from the apartment next door. The landlord's face went pale. She looked down, hesitant to speak. "No one lives in that apartment," she said softly. "It's been empty for over 10 years. Skeptical, Sam asked her to explain. The landlord hesitated, then told him a story, one that had been kept quiet for years. She explained that a woman used to live there years ago. She had moved in with her infant son, and everything seemed fine. But one night, tragedy struck. The woman's child had died suddenly, without warning. Heartbroken and unable to cope with her grief, the woman herself passed away just a few weeks later. Some say it was from a broken heart. Others whisper it was something more sinister. After the landlord finished his story, Sam felt an icy chill run down his spine. The crying he had been hearing was not from a living neighbor, but from a spirit. The sorrow of the mother, eternally mourning her lost child, had never left. That night, Sam tried to sleep, but the crying returned, louder and more desperate than ever. He covered his ears, tried to block it out, but it was no use. In a panic, he fled his apartment, unable to endure the endless sobbing of the ghost next door. Sam moved out the next day, leaving the apartment and its ghostly occupant behind. But some nights, if you walk past that old building, you can still hear the faint sound of a mother's tears echoing through the walls. Number 2. The Locked Room. A young man, let's call him Robert, When Robert moved into his new apartment, he was excited. The building was old, full of character, and his unit was spacious, far more than he had expected. But one thing caught his attention: a door, locked tight, with no key. The landlord had brushed it off, saying it was a storage room and not to worry about it. At first, Robert didn't give it much thought. The apartment was perfect in every other way. But over time, curiosity got the better of him. The door became a mystery that gnawed at him. Why was it locked? What was inside? He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just a storage room, as the landlord had said. But some nights, when the apartment was silent, he swore he could hear faint sounds coming from behind the door. Soft tapping, like someone gently knocking. One night, Robert decided he'd had enough. He had to know what was behind the door. Armed with a flashlight and a set of tools, he set to work. It took him hours to pry the lock loose, but eventually the door creaked open. The air inside was cold, musty, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The room was dark, empty. At least, that's what it seemed like at first. But as he stepped inside, the flashlight flickered, revealing something strange. Scattered on the floor were old toys, dolls, wooden blocks, and a small rocking chair sitting in the corner. He bent down, picking up one of the dolls. It was old, its face cracked, its dress faded. But there was something else. Underneath the dust, he noticed marks on the floor, small scratches, like something had been dragged across the room. Robert's heart raced. He turned quickly, shining the flashlight toward the scratches. His beam landed on the small rocking chair, which now moved gently, back and forth on its own. It creaked softly, as if someone invisible was sitting there, rocking quietly. Robert froze. The air seemed to thicken around him, the temperature dropping suddenly. The tapping noise returned, this time louder. He spun around, pointing the flashlight towards the door. But it wasn't coming from there. It was coming from behind the wall. Slowly, he approached, his flashlight flickering as he got closer. The tapping grew louder, faster, as if something or someone was trying to get out. With trembling hands, he pressed his ear to the wall, and that's when he heard it, a soft voice, whispering, pleading.
Let me out.
He ran. He scrambled for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The tapping became frantic, the voice more insistent. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking it with the old rusty key that had fallen out of his pocket. Robert didn't sleep that night. He sat in his bedroom staring at the locked door, waiting for the tapping to return. But it never did. The apartment fell silent once more, but the memory of the voice, of the rocking chair, lingered.
Let me out.
He never went into that room again. Days later, he moved out, never telling anyone what he had heard, what he had seen. Number 3, the old lady in the hall. A young woman, let's call her Julia, moved into her new apartment. The building was old, the kind that had history and secrets. She loved her new place, but there was one thing she couldn't explain. Every night, just after midnight, she heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. At first, she thought it was just her neighbor. The sound was light, almost like a shuffle, as if someone with weak legs was walking slowly by. But night after night, the footsteps were always the same, steady, unchanging, at the exact same time. Curious, Julia peeked out of her door one night, expecting to see one of the elderly residents making their way to the elevator, but the hallway was empty. Night after night, the footsteps continued. Julia tried to ignore them, telling herself it was just her imagination. But one night, she decided to stay up and watch. Sitting on the couch, she waited, eyes on the door. Midnight came, and so did the footsteps. They were closer this time. Julia could hear them right outside her door. Her heart raced as she quietly stood up and tiptoed to the peephole. She hesitated, then looked through. Standing in the hallway, just outside her door, was an old woman. She wore a long, tattered dress, her hair white and stringy, and her back hunched over. She wasn't moving, just standing there facing Julia's door. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't recognize the woman. She'd never seen her before in the building. Slowly, she stepped away from the door, afraid to make a sound. The footsteps resumed, but this time they weren't walking away. They were shuffling back and forth right outside her door. Minutes passed, but the old woman never knocked, never said a word. She just kept pacing outside. Julia was frozen in place, heart racing. She knew she had to do something, but what could she say? What could she do? Finally, the footsteps stopped. Julia waited, listening. The hallway was silent once more. She took a deep breath and went straight to bed, wondering what on earth just happened. The next day, Julia asked around. She talked to the neighbors, describing the woman she'd seen, but no one knew who she was. Some of the older residents shrugged it off, saying they hadn't seen anyone like that in years. That's when Julia learned something strange. Years ago, there had been an old woman who lived on her floor. She had died in her apartment, alone. They said she was quiet, never caused any trouble, but she used to walk the halls late at night, just like Julia had heard. And now it seemed she had never left. That night, Julia lay in bed, listening. The clock ticked closer to midnight. She told herself it was just a coincidence, just a story, but as the clock struck 12, the familiar footsteps echoed down the hallway once more. This time, Julia didn't go to the door. She didn't look through the peephole. She just lay there listening as the old lady in the hall passed by her door and disappeared into the silence.